to thank everybody for joining today. This is part of our Visual Analytics webinar series, Complements of Teknion Data Solutions. And so today's focus is on Beyond Color Myths, and this is really focusing on functional aesthetics that allow for better design. I'm Bridget Cogley. I'm a 4-time Tableau Zen Master, as well as a Senior Consultant at Teknion Data Solutions. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and answer some of the top most asked questions. The first most asked question is, yes, the recording will be posted. It will be out on the Teknion website in our webinars section. Good news is a link will be sent out with an email as well. And then also for kind of fun, we've got a Q&A panel within the Zoom. Feel free to ask questions as they come up. They will be answered at the end, but feel free that as I'm presenting, just go ahead and throw a question in. If it gets answered with the presentation, I'll at least kind of call out a reminder for it as well. So again, key thing is the recording will be posted. It is recording now. So today's agenda is a mix of 3 things. There's a lot of myth busting about how color plays into perception. I've got a number of tips that will be included within myth busting. I've got a very small section of tips that are separate, and then I've got some details into how you can use a process to help you better use color. Usually when I talk to people about color, people tend not to feel very good about color. Color is complex, it's a struggle for a lot of people, and so that's a part of why I did this presentation. And so without further ado, I really want to jump into this idea of universals. When I talk to people about perception, we get told, hey, these certain things are universal. And one of my favorite challenges to that is this dress. And so a lot of people see a mix of colors. I've done this live in demos. We had planned it a little bit better. I might have done a poll here, but when I've done this, what I find is roughly about 57% of people see, and studies have shown this as well, is about 50% of people see this as either purple or black. There's about 30% that see it as white and gold. And then there's, 13, maybe 15%, let's say they see it as something totally different. Now, we're all analysts here, and so yes, definitely the demographics like gender or age, and even brain activity can be a factor. I'm solidly in the white and gold camp, so fair warning. So the lesson from this, and what's really neat, is that particular exercise kicked off a ton of research into how is it that we see. And one of our big takeaways from this is that perception varies. And so my other call out here is that for that reason, accessibility matters from the start, because accessibility helps improve color understanding for everybody. So I'll jump into another one, and that's where when we look at the smaller boxes within this subset, we see these 2 different boxes. And I love to play this game of, is one darker than the other? And sometimes it seems like the one on the right is perhaps maybe a little bit lighter. And so, I had to do this for myself, but they are the same color, and that is down to the Chubb illusion. And what's really fun about the Chubb illusion is that we see this play out in the real world. We make some of these charts, we see it on maps, we see it in a number of places where as we look through here, it's kind of a struggle to figure out which numbers of these are identical. And the answer may surprise you, because even as I look at some of these, they look different to me. When I look at Q versus A, I feel like Q is much darker. And even though I've got this line going back and forth, my brain still tells me, no, 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 that can't be true. And so that's something to consider when we look at how we make our charts, is that color itself is really determined relative to its surroundings, but also size and position. All of that affects how we see color. Going on further, I've got what I kind of call my brain breakers, and I love these because you don't necessarily expect them. I'm going to apologize up front now to anybody who's either prone to migraines or anything else. This one really affects me pretty profoundly. It's going to affect some people profoundly, so I'm not going to leave it on the screen very long. But if you're looking at it, it should definitely be looking like it's scintillating to you. So when we do certain types of charts, sometimes the contrast between them has that same effect, where when we look at something like this, it may have it even if we lighten it up a bit and thicken up the lines, it may have it as well. And so from a practice side, I tend to err more on this side, where you'll notice that the lines are actually the same color as the data mark itself. They're also much, much lighter, but that allows you to see the data point rather than if we go back right now, what I see is the grid versus the data points themselves. So that's something to consider, is that it's not just color of the marks themselves, but also the other pieces around the marks. One of the other things when I do this presentation is I get told, well, we notice bright colors. So, I mean, a lot of people probably see that green, they probably see the red mark, and they're, bright colors. These are very, very bright colors. They're very prominent. Now, one of the other challenges, though, is that we actually notice difference. So bright colors stand out when they're not necessarily juxtaposed against something very bright. But if I put something here very bright, some of my brighter colors fade away. Some of the items with the most contrast are the ones with either low to no color. So I've got some black squares that probably stand out, maybe drive you a little crazy. But then I've got an odd pink square that's just, it stands out, probably not as much so as some of the other pieces. So what we notice is that relational contrast. And that too really plays into some accessibility thoughts. So when you look at how we see light and looking at things like starlight versus moonlight versus say indoor lighting, or even sunlight, and then you get to that higher intensity, which is too bright. And I'm definitely somebody who's very sensitive to that too bright, whereas other folks really struggle with some of that darker areas as well. So that's where we see some of those discussions about how do we make things accessible. And so this is definitely not an end-all be-all presentation on accessibility. There's a lot of resources out there. I'll include those later on in links. But one of the most common referred to items is Web Content and Accessibility Guidelines. So WCAG if you want, WCAG. And one of many recommendations that they have out there is kind of this ratio of lighter to darker. And so you've got two different levels, and they define this a number of ways. There's a ton of caveats and nuance with this, but they've got two different ratings. You've got AAA, which is really, really great for a higher contrast. You've got this AA, which is kind of that bare bones minimum. And so one example I have here is I've got this lighter colored nope on kind of a lighter gray. And you'll notice that when I test it, it fails. It fails with flying colors. And I mean, it seems like, oh, well, maybe it's kind of close, but no, it's really not. If I modify the background of that a little bit, so that middle option, you can see with that, I finally get at least a AA, that, there are tools out there that help me kind of see, okay, I can change the background up a smidge. Honestly, as a designer, that background change is nominal. So I would have absolutely no problem. Sometimes we get really locked in on we must have these colors, but you see how such a subtle change makes it a little bit more accessible. Same thing with the font. All I had to do was change the font a little bit, and that made it far more accessible. Again, this is still bare bones guidelines. So if I look at some of the other guidelines, AA would require a higher degree. So there is also AAA, and that would require some more changes. Probably another one that I get told a lot when I go places is, things like red universally means bad, stop, love, or passion. And so, PMS, Pantone Color Management System, is really made a wonderful living off of kind of what I call color stories. And so we get these ingrained in our history. And so this is a fun test. I love when I'm able to do this live, because trying to get people to say the color, not the word, it's really, really fun. I can try to demo it to you. You will see how very quickly I start reading the word. So if I'm looking at, I've got red, I've got blue, I've got green, I have yellow, green, and then I've got black. You'll notice I'm struggling. It's taking me time. That goes down to the Stroop effect. And so different people are affected by this more so than others. Again, I could go through the long exercise and you would see how painful it is for me to try to overcome this. And we also have this in visualization. So we've got a very literal example here of food where I'm examining spices. And so if you look, I have things like garlic, black pepper, and coriander colored blue, whereas I've got things down towards the bottom like fenugreek, and parsley colored in orange. If you spend any time in the kitchen, and we're all spending a little bit more time in the kitchen these days, this probably does not line up with your experience. It probably doesn't necessarily make sense. The colors may be pretty, but there's something about it that's perhaps a bit disjointed. And so when I switch this around and I line up our colors perhaps with a more normal or expected paradigm, you'll notice I've colored garlic more of a yellow color. I've got black pepper in black. And as I get down to those bottom items, such as fennel and fenugreek and parsley, which are leaves, I've chosen to make them green. Now, from a designer perspective, I have a lot of colors on this. So while semantically I've made these colors line up, it may be a little overwhelming for my end users. And so I may choose to kind of round these colors, if you will. I may say, you know what, I want to kind of cluster these into maybe flavors of family or things like that so that they still line up with that Stroop effect, but perhaps aren't as heavily colored across each one of those. So this is an example of playing with Stroop. And when I click on the filters, you can see how the colors perhaps maybe line up with my expectations of what a savory flavor would look like. Or maybe my hot. As I look through hot, I may notice I've got a lot in orange, which lines up with things like cayenne and paprika and cinnamon. But then I've also got things like ginger. And so I can kind of start to see the differences and how colors kind of flow with flavor. Along with sweet, you'll notice I've got a lot of brown. Again, this is very personal. There's a lot with perception in this, and it also relies on a familiarity with spices. So I have good news for you. I'm not the only one obsessed with Stroop. Tableau did a lab a few years back. Vidya Settler and Maureen Stone were some of the investigators on this, where they looked at Tableau default colors. Here we've got these items that have semantic meaning, and we're just going to throw colors on them versus, hey, let's create an algorithm that tries to kind of understand what these items are in real life. And so you can see, for example, cucumbers is probably my favorite because I feel like that color comes more from pickles than from cucumbers themselves. Iceberg lettuce, another kind of interesting one. But you can see the difference and also how you understand these charts just by the choice of color. So that's Stroop, and Stroop is probably one of the most powerful tools out there, and it's one I actually use a lot in my own visualizations beyond just the literal paradigm of this item is always this color. So the nice part is I can say, hey, I'm going to start creating Stroop-like effects. And so this is a common visualization I've shown out there a few times. And one of the things I've done, and a secret to its power, is the hidden Stroop effects. So anything sales related is in kind of a gray palette. Anything profit related is in a purple palette. And anything amount related is in a red. So you see I've got contrast. You see I've got an association created without an explicit being told of it. And so that's one of the powers of this particular style. Another area that I've used this in is kind of calls to action. When I need people to do things, I will say, okay, I've got one color palette to rule them all. And so you see I've got one chart where there's color and a bunch of charts where they're fairly monochromatic. And so rather than having all four colors on at a time, only one gets displayed. And then you can also see I'm reaffirming your understanding of that with kind of the call out towards the bottom of the map. So that named sponsorships, if I go back, you can see it says subscription. So one of the things I'm also doing is I'm not relying on color explicitly, but it is there so that when you do see it, it helps guide that action. You know you're dealing with named sponsorships. The longer you use this, the more you start knowing that this is always that. And that becomes one less decision or one less item you have to explore. So red sometimes means bad, stop, love, passion. But the best part is we can retrain it. And so if I start, in my organization, I want bad to be yellow, or I want stop to be gray, or hey, I'm going to make love this really wild green and passion's going to be purple. The fun part is I can do it, and Pantone has taught me well, because I can look at the history of a word like clean. And so if you go way back into the 1920s and earlier, you can see where a lot of cleaning products were yellow. And it was yellow like sunshine. And then after a while, they became white. White became the color of clean. And again, some of these have overlap. At one point, blue became the color of clean. So you think of products like Windex, where you've got this really strong blue color. And you can also say, hey, white's still in the picture. Absolutely. One of the modern things that started happening, and I want to say it was in kind of the mid 2000s, is that green became clean. And not just any shade of green. It was a very explicit shade of this is clean because it's natural, it's free of chemicals. And so you can see how this color story happened. One question I've had in the past with this is, is this generational? Is there an age to this? Absolutely. So this is definitely an indicator of both age and culture and exposure and attitude. So you can definitely see how some of these concepts get trained. Probably one of my other favorite sections of this is the dropped connections. We have a lot of color stories out there where, for example, one thing we get told is, hey, we've got these ideas of complementary colors. And so, you always think, hey, we look marvelous together. One of the stories about complementary colors is that it comes from the old Latin compleo, or complete. So if I take a violet and this yellow, I mix them together, they kind of all turn brown at the middle. And so the idea of complementary colors is not necessarily that they look beautiful together, they do, but also that they end up canceling each other out. So if I'm doing a lighting show and I use purple and yellow, the really awesome thing is when I make a Venn diagram of them, they turn white. And if I'm doing art, at the very middle, they really kind of blur into either like a brown or a black. So that's really the other part of complementary colors, is knowing that in traditional mediums, if I'm using them, they cancel each other out. But here's the thing, and I'm going to apologize to you now. Complementary colors typically also create this effect called chromostereopsis. So again, it's that canceling each other out. They end up creating a 3D effect. So if you're attempting to read this and really, really struggling, or you're looking at this going, why in the world is this floating? I did not put 3D effects on this. That is purely the effect of having complementary colors on top of each other. There's also a balance of hue. So these definitely are better. For me personally, the yellow one is actually better. The red is actually still glowing. So that's another effect of color. I found this in the wild, so I really have to give a shout out to Marion. She posted this, and in particular, the light gray background just tends to make these bounce around. And so that was a conversation that happened on Twitter. So this is a real effect. It happens in real life, whether we intend it to or not. I was so excited to see this in the wild, I had to share. Now, to me, my all-time favorite color myth goes back about 200 years, and it's the stoplight colors. And so I have a lot of folks tell me stoplight colors are intuitive. They are ingrained, and that red means stop, yellow always means slow, and green means go. And, we have history to thank for this. So if we go back in time, back before we had lights everywhere, and when stars were our primary form of light. So I mean, really think back 200 plus years ago, and we're laying down railroad tracks, and we need a way to effectively communicate to those driving the trains that, hey, at some point you're going to have to stop. We needed lights. And so way back in the days of yore, the colors selected were red for stop and white for all clear. There's a reason for this, and it all boils down to how we see. And so when you think about how we see and you're stumbling around in the dark, you have the rods in your eyes to thank for the little bit that you can see. So as you're stumbling around and you're tripping on things, which is what I always do, it's the rods in your eyes. So it's that kind of stereo mode where you can kind of see, but it's not, there is almost no color when you are seeing in dark colors, and that's because you're using the rods. When we get into cones, you've got blue. You'll notice that my wavelength of light is much, much, much lower for blue, and it even peaks much, much, much lower. When I get into my green cones, you'll see that that shifts over a bit, and the color that I'm most likely to see the farthest You guessed it, red. Here's everybody's next favorite question. White includes all of them. So it's back to that, they cancel each other out. Here's what you might have missed. So as I was telling you my story about the railroad, I had those teeny tiny lights flashing. And when I do this live, every now and then I get one person that goes, hey, there was a red dot. And I love when I get that. So when we think about stoplight colors, it really goes back to how distance created one of the most powerful myths. So we needed red because a long time ago we were very, very far away from something. And so red carries the farthest. Unfortunately, what happened is we forgot the origins of this myth and we brought this into our dashboards. We've been told red is always bad, green is always good, and red means we must stop this thing and green means we can go ahead with this thing. And we've brought this into our design. We've had this perpetuated throughout history. I also blame the 80s and Karma Karma Chameleon as a hit. I'll throw that one out there. I blame them as well for perpetuating it because I can. And so when you look at this dashboard, it's very, very hard to make a decision. We've got a lot of information. I've got a lot of encoding, and so I'm trying to figure out what do I do, what don't I do. At the end of the day, I want readmission to stop. So yes, anything red, I'm going to try to get rid of. But sometimes it's very hard to make a decision as I get deeper into kind of this chart and I see different things are colored red, different spots are red. And as I'm looking through here, sometimes it's like, well, maybe this isn't so bad. But there's just a lot going on. The challenge is when we bring in our colorblind friends, and about 5% of people are, they have a hard time navigating this, particularly if it's in all black or if you get kind of these different shades of brown. So some people can actually see it reasonably well. Doesn't look that great. It's a bit far off from my design and some of the encoding down here gets lost. But when I look at where I've got a lot of sea of yellow, I've really made this highly, highly, highly inaccessible to a portion of people. So we forgot a couple things though when we looked at our traffic light. And I'll call out the first one, which is only one goes off at a time. We don't have all three signals going at once, we have one. But here's the other thing we forgot, is that we intentionally put guardrails around the lights so that other people who aren't intended to see that signal don't see the signal. So when I take this report and I go back to the real truth of the traffic light, I'm going to focus on what signal do I really want to send. And so by putting this in black and white, I get a better idea of these are the things that really, really matter. So folks, I apologize. You came to a color webinar to learn to design in black and white. So when we design in grayscale, it really forces us to pick. It forces us to say these things are really, really bad and we want to stop them, or hey, these things are really, really good and this is the message I want to carry forth. It also forces me as a designer to really shift how I think. And it makes it so that I add color last, not first. And so often, particularly with tools like Tableau, we throw that color on first. We get very inert as we're making our charts, we throw it all together in a dashboard, and we end up in a color conundrum. By adding it last, we also support that guidance that says, hey, don't primarily depend on color. So it also makes our designs a lot more accessible. So accessibility is an area we struggle in, as well as prioritizing our colors. If we take it out of the equation, it becomes that much easier to then pick a signal that I want to boost, as well as potentially even brand. So you can see now I've got one color to choose from. I've got fairly clear inputs and outputs, and I can very easily make my decision. So that's kind of a touch on where, consideration for accessibility, it's not just a matter of taste. It's something that really helps all users, particularly those most affected. Color blindness is one example, but we've also got where blindness and or low vision is a factor. So you can see where just by changing these, and again, keeping in mind too, that again, you've got kind of that AA versus AAA, and that AAA really is a little bit more accommodating, and you'll notice that it does require a higher contrast. But there's also neurological differences to consider, and those aren't always well publicized. So things like migraines and even seizures, we can, with our designs, potentially invoke a response. So that's something to consider as well. So accessibility really depends on the ask, it depends on testing it with users, and I would say that the requester is the expert. With accessibility, you will run into sometimes where there's a conflict. I've seen some designs out there in Tableau where you can use parameters to allow a toggle, and that's a great way to overcome the, hey, I've got this challenge of person A wants this, person B wants this, and they're just not compatible. The final piece of this gets into the idea of branding. When we work for companies, we really want to make these brands stand out. It really helps with adoption. It makes it very, very clear where these items come from. We love our branding. And so I've got an example here. I found this on the internet. I was like, this is great. And I wanted to showcase, here's how I can incorporate it. So I've taken a riff off the dashboard that you saw earlier, and I said, hey, look, here it is. I have made this dashboard. I've maybe simplified parts of it where I had PowerPoint art in it. And here we go, I've got this dashboard. Well, the challenge as I look through this is some of these colors really are not easy to discern or tell apart. So this is a pretty color palette when you put it on a website. When I start using it for data, and I've got a lot of categorical data where having those differences are important, really this is not the best color palette for me. So here comes the really, really terrifying part of this webinar. And when you say, hey, I got to do this, you now have a webinar you can point to. I'm going to go out to Palatone.com. I'm going to look for a peripheral color palette. Yes, folks, you heard me. I'm adding colors to the brand color palette, and this is why. What this allows me to do is now I have 4 equally balanced colors to where I can say, hey, now I can very visually see this and tell these items apart. I can also potentially make relationships depending on how I order these so that people understand certain items are more preferred than others. So that's kind of an example of what happens when I've got no opposites, or I've got I need to increase discernment. The other thing that happens when I look at some of these palettes is I have no way to mark a negative appropriately. So if I want to make a good show of, hey, I've got all these positive things, but then I need something to counterbalance it as a negative. Again, this is where, to me, Palatone is a great tool. I go there, I say, hey, I'm going to change the ratio on this. And when I go in, I get this awesome orange. And the nice part is it counterbalances perfectly against that primary blue that I'm using. So that way, when I make dashboards like this, where I need that negative relationship of here's a positive, here's a negative, I can really highlight those items and I can bring in those other colors. So again, typically when you're working with brands, almost be prepared to add color. And the reason is because you need it from a data standpoint. So some other examples, I've got the Columbus Zoo. Shout out to anybody here in Columbus. This is their animal guide and finder. I did this a long time ago. I said, hey, this is really cool. And so, you go in and this is some of what their brand assets look like. So you'll notice that when you're doing color, it's great to go and get research because ideally your marketing team has already considered things like accessibility and so forth. And then you can make things like this, where you can start saying, hey, I'm going to continue world building off of the world that was already created. Final example here is one from a client of mine. So this is kind of their website. You can see, again, not a high amount of color contrast. You can see some of the brand assets. And so that's what I take into consideration as I start building these dashboards is, okay, they use a lot of triangles. I'm going to use that as a brand asset. I'm going to use this green as a highlight and let the blue be the background. So these are some ways to incorporate brand colors, and it's made much easier when you start in black and white. So when you're using these brand colors, you want to keep your hair in, you want to have it not go gray, and you don't want to tear it out. Do an investigation, really go to their website, their PowerPoint, any kind of marketing materials that they have, whatever style guides they provide you. But you're looking for any type of color that's in a similar range. So you're kind of finding those complements. You can see in my picture over here, I have them. I have a lot of complements. They're all on the same side of the wheel. When I'm looking for those contrasts, I don't have them. And so for this client, when I've needed it, because that green is my primary counterpoint, I've gone with purple as my negative. When I'm looking at colorblind accessibility, I'm really making sure that people can see it, that the most amount of people can see it, but then I'm also cueing in another way. And that also helps support some accessibility considerations. When I'm looking at color families, I can also use transparency. So I can say, hey, here's 80%, here's 60%, here's 40%, and that allows some discernment. Another ratio I kind of use is that 75, 55, 35, so you can see that step down again. But my big thing with color is don't be afraid to add colors. The trick is you want to make sure they balance, and you can do so mathematically with tools like Palatone. So this is kind of my big color secret. It allows you to really mathematically say, hey, this is kind of the degree of difference. There's some other tools as well I'll include in an email to also then test. So you've got your colorblind testing that's available within this tool, but then you've got some other tools where you can say, hey, if I want to put this as text, is that friendly enough? So that's kind of the end of this. I'm going to go ahead and say that now is your time to shine for questions. The other thing is the recording will be posted, the links will be sent out in email, and so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the questions that we have. So, so far the only question I've got is that will the recording be sent out? So yes, the recording will definitely be sent out. And let's see, what else do we have? So I'm just checking the comments. Okay, if there's any other questions, feel free. So I've got a couple more questions. And I'll go ahead and put the screen back on. And so one question is, can you give a bit more information on how you use Palatone.com? Absolutely. So I will go ahead and actually jump right out to Palatone. It's one of my favorite tools. I've got a few different ones that I use fairly frequently. And so let me So this is Palatone, and what's really nice about Palatone is you can start with a color, and I can say, hey, I've got, these colors, and I can input any color I want through the hex. So really helpful when you're using with Tableau. Because you can just pull a hex in, you can start saying, okay, I want, here's my complementary colors, you can move them around. So it's like maybe I'm starting fresh and I don't have a particular thing in mind. You'll notice that it tells me about the hues, so that gives me an idea of how things distribute in this particular circle. Yes, I can pull them around. Yes, I can pull them down and move them around. I don't recommend playing so much in this area until you're a little bit more familiar. And then you can also start playing with the relationships. So I've really gotten into an attractive color palette right now. So I'll go ahead and cancel out of this. And then the other thing too is if you ever get too lost, which again, this happens with me as well, you can always reset. Big fan of that, but again, I usually will, if by default, I tend to go with blues. Blues tend to be the most accessible color. And then I'll kind of go from there. So if I'm starting from scratch, you'll see the distance here is 30. Maybe I want to up this to 45 just to get a little bit more discernment. You can see this is a pretty dark jewel tone color palette. So I may look at that. I may also come over to my vision simulation and say, okay, I want to see what this looks like when I've got color blindness thrown in. So this is where you can say, I want to play with the colors. And then the nice part is it warns you. So you can say, okay, I want to turn that off. I want to maybe move this a bit more. And maybe I want to go with 60 just to get a little bit more discernment. So these are all tools. The other part is it shows you this. And then for anybody who's in the palette, so where you're actually going in and doing a lot of making your own custom palettes, you can export these. They do export in a number of ways. So you can say, okay, here's my color list. I export it as text. And the cool part is you actually get, here's your hex codes and everything else. So you actually get all those colors and you can kind of throw them into a custom Tableau color palette. So that's a bit about Palatone. Cannot recommend its use enough. I mean, it's been probably one of the best tools in my career as far as coming up with colors, really making sure that colors work. And then when I get brand standards, and unfortunately I find I do run into a fair amount of brand standards that just either from a data side don't have enough, either that allow me kind of that categorical side, or hey, I really need those opposites. And so I may even play with that further and say I want two different opposites so that I've got a couple different diverging palettes. So next question is, how do you feel about the default color palettes in Tableau? One of my really neat things I found out a long time ago, and I was just enamored and amazed, is Maureen Stone is one of the color researchers at Tableau. And so she did this whole analysis and redo of Tableau's colors. And so I'm a big fan of the research that went behind it and some of the thought that went into how do you build distributed color palettes and really getting this set up so that you can see it. Let me see if I can't find that. Probably find it better visually. So there was a lot of thought put into just how these color palettes were made. And so I really appreciate that part. From a branding side, from a use side, I have certain ones I tend to favor. So the automatic I tend not to use, but I tend to use other ones. But what I really appreciate about the Tableau color palette is that there's a lot of thought to the weighting. Again, I've spent a lot of time doing this, so I'm a little bit more willing to jump out of the shaped norm. But if you're just starting out, I think they're a great place to start, especially if you start playing in some of like the Jewel Bright, the Nuriel stones and things like that. I feel that those give you a really nice variety. And let's see, do you design your dashboards with color in mind or after your dashboard's complete? For me, it's a mix. So if I'm dealing with a company and a brand, I've kind of got their colors, I'll go do a whole color investigation. So it's back to that, do your homework, do your research. So there's a level of that. When I'm doing a lot of my free plays, so when I'm going out on public and saying, you know what, I want to make this concept, I mean, I really try to start in black and white. I find that when I start in that black and white, I'm a lot more successful. And then when I bring it in after the fact, it's a lot easier. So I really try not to go in like it must be these colors. And so some of this too just comes from years and years and years and years of doing this. There is a level of practice as well. So it's kind of a mix of both. And then another question is, how do you maintain color across reports or how do you maintain color across Tableau reports for an entire organization? I would say the biggest key to that is really building those custom color palettes. So when you go into Tableau, you can do your own custom color palette. And I can't recommend that enough. And I'll go ahead and very, very quickly kind of showcase a post that you can go to grab that. Because that's one of those, you do it in Notepad, you drag a file into that, and it's really helpful to have that. Now, the one thing is that is considered a hack, but it's a hack that is definitely very, very useful. And then two, if you're the admin, if you're running this and saying, you know what, I can send an install and things like that, it's really powerful to include that preferences file with that as well. So that's kind of a start. Let me do this quick search. So the color palettes are really nice because again, you can kind of say, hey, these are the preferences. You can build out what a preference file looks like. And so this has a preference file kind of included, buried in there so that if you want some of these colors, you can actually go in and say, okay, I want these colors, and then use that. So there is that. So I would definitely say making the color palettes. The other thing I've seen is NetJets has a whole evaluation process. And I really like when they do kind of their grade reports and they say, hey, you know, we evaluated this. And so that's another way. Next question is there a max color you recommend to add? Honestly, less is more. So, I mean, you see, I've got a lot of dashboards where I have just two colors. I've got a color in black and white, and then you can see here, this is a lot of color. I also find it helps to have color families. So the more brightly colored things are, and everything like that, the harder it is to process. It's just, there's a lot visually going on. So to me, color is one of those things where you throw too much on it, gets very, very overwhelming. And then there is definitely a benefit to, if you are going to have a lot of color, again, make sure that it's not a primary way of understanding it. And then two, make sure there's ways of getting to that information without color. So things like highlights are a very powerful tool. So to me, color is definitely one of those use it last. I would say less than 5. Any more than that, you really, really get it very, very busy. Would you suggest avoiding red and green due to the obvious assumptions? Absolutely. I have rants for days on red and green. Some of them are just not nice. It's just when you look at red and green compared to some of the other design processes, it's not nice. It's really just, it's not a pleasant color combination versus some of the other ones out there that you can have. And I'm saying this as somebody where I've had clients where that is their color palette. And what I've had to do is really find ways to track them and have them be apart. So a couple more questions. Some of us are still stuck in the grid style of reporting. Any recommendations to us to make a better experience for business partners? So that we have another webinar of how to escape the table trap. I'm one of these real extreme, just start really throwing things out there. Joshua has a much nicer approach of easing people into bars, easing people into visualizations. So sometimes what I do is a real, here's your very tabular style, and then, hey, here's more of this very visual approach. So sometimes I tell the same story twice. That's another way to kind of at least help people make that progress. I also find too, when you really sit down with somebody who's very, very determined it must be this way, and you say, hey, how can I really help you? And you work with them and you get them on your side, that tends to make it easier to get success. So next question is, what ratio % of highlight colors do you recommend to use on the screen or slide so it doesn't become too busy? The recent trend tends to be using more and more of the white areas. So for example, Microsoft Office. So thinking about making things not busy. So again, it really goes back to this idea of how do I set the tone? You'll notice here's an example of here's a completely in the grayscale. And so this is another color test, is when do I lose meaning? So as I look through here, I can understand this fairly fine without color. As I look through here, I can also understand this chart without color. By the time I get here, I start struggling with this overnight, day, and evening, and that's when I would throw in color. And then two, I've got these lines. It would help to have color there. So this is another area where when you think about color, look at where you start to struggle, and then that's where you start throwing in the color. And so I'm actually going to go back to the original version of that, because to me that was the one that I ended up liking the most. And so that's that same dashboard. But you'll notice again a fair amount of white space, and even still a lot of very light lines. So you've got some heavy weight, but again, it's a balance of where do you want the eye to go? So I've got another presentation particularly for white space, which would be the logic of dashboards, and I would recommend that. And then getting into, can you also share your Tableau public profile? So yes, absolutely. So easiest way to get to my Tableau public profile is I'm kind of that /Bridget. You can also do a search, but I will definitely make sure that my Tableau public is included in the link. And I think we might have reached the end of the questions. If there's not any more questions, I'll go ahead and close out and give you a couple minutes back to your day. But thank you for coming. And then again, if you want to learn more about color, this is an area that I'm spending a fair bit of time on my blog. So that's Tableau Fit. And then I've got specifically tagged under colors. So I have things like Stripified discussed here. I've got mixed signaling. I've got a number of other things kind of shown here of how to do color. Here's some more tips. So this is definitely an area of investment. Also throw in that we are continuing to do visual analytics webinars. So there will be more snapped onto this series with different topics. So feel free to email us and let us know if there are certain topics you would love for us to cover. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and just check. I've got a couple comments also in the Slack, just making sure that there aren't any questions. So let's see, I do have one question around, let's see, red. So one question is, how do you use shades of red effectively? Always seems like red and pink clash. Typically red and pink will clash. You'll want to put some extra color in that red. Won't lie, for the most part, red is one of those colors that, particularly in visualization, if I'm able to avoid it, I will. So you'll notice, for example, like this is more of a pink. I wouldn't put a red in there because definitely would really, really clash and struggle. That's also where if I want things to not clash or be terrible, I'm going to go right into that Palatone and say, okay, I want some of these colors. Maybe I want to come here and find a color that would work. This would give you some idea of how do I get a color palette. You know, I want to get into that pink zone and maybe get something that's not horrifically garish. So that's where I would probably play it there. So that's kind of the answer to that. And I think that is everything. So thank you very much. Again, this webinar has been recorded, and then we will be emailing out links and everything of that sort. So thank you again very much.